law, especially with reference to some of the slightly more controversial judgments, because there are clearly some gray areas in them, including Sabrimala, adultery, even 377, which is progressive in so much as it decriminalizes something that should never have been criminalized in the first place. There are issues that are there that some people have been speaking about. What are your views on these?
Well, I think all of these are separate issues. And therefore, you can't have a generalized comment on all of them. There are some judgments which, in terms of the political and economic life of the country, would be very important. Aadhaar, for instance. But leaving all those apart, I think if you take each one of them separately, there will be larger issues which arise out of them. Now, you mentioned the 377 judgment with regard to decriminalization. I think all social reforms in a society come when there is a sustained campaign for those reforms, those changes, and thereafter either a legislative change comes or a judicial pronouncement comes and it affects them. And societies get into a mood to accept that change. And in India, we've had, at least I can say, with regard to many religions and social practices, which have reformed over the last 60, 70 years, and reformed perhaps for the better. I think the debate on 377 was on for a long time. It was a global debate. And on the issue of decriminalization, there was an international trend which was on. In fact, I was one of the first persons in political life years ago who had commented that time had now come to decriminalize it. The society may have accepted it. It took some time. There was a favorable judicial verdict, an adverse verdict. And then finally came the Constitution bench. And I think it's been received fairly okay and fairly well. I'm not on the decriminalization part. Sure. There is some reasoning which has been given, and since I had a lot of time in the last couple of months to read each one of them, so I have read them at length. I think not being against the order of nature was a possible view, they took it. No discrimination on basis of sexes was a possible view, they took it. Sexual activity as a part of Article 21, the right to life, was a possible view, they took it. But I think the problem comes when writing these historical judgments, you get carried away and want to be a part of history. And therefore, you go a step further. So whereas these three reasonings I fairly agree with, the fourth one I completely disagree with, that it's also a part of free speech. Because I think that's a little excessive. And the consequences of that may not be on decriminalization. But free speech is an entirely different gambit. It can be restrained only on reasons of sovereignty, security, public order, and so on. And mind you, these, because there is a tendency to keep on creating new fundamental rights every day. So when you convert this into a fundamental right and say it's free speech, then how do you restrain any form of sexual activity, homosexual or bisexual, in a school hostel, in a prison, in an army frontier? And unless in a subsequent view it is clarified, that fourth observation, which was not necessary for the purpose of deciding this case, I think is something which requires a further debate. I went through the adultery judgment, and the section itself was very, very badly worded. if a man finds that he can be prosecuted if he has sex with a married woman without her husband's consent. So with consent you can do it, without consent you can't do it. So they were entitled to come to probably a legitimate view. In today's world, this kind of a section can't exist. So they rightly quashed it. But then you went a step further. And the step further was, some of the judges, well, these are matrimonial offenses, these are personal wrongs and not public wrongs, therefore outside the purview of criminal law. Now, would that cover bigamy and polygamy also? It's a personal wrong. Will that cover cruelty? Will that cover dowry offenses? Now, if this logic started covering them, then it would be a wholly anti-woman judgment. Now, such views maybe apparently appear progressive. So I am not in dispute that the section needed to be quashed. But the latter view may find a reference in some Western journals very favorably, but it may end up converting the Indian family system into a Western family system, where the fragility of marriage as an institution itself may increase. And therefore, you will probably require to debate that second part of the observation, which again was not necessary for the purpose of deciding this case.
So you're saying they should have just stuck to the point of law?
They should have stuck to the legal issue of discussing that section and quashing it. So being carried away and writing, going further, in future cases, those observations can have an adverse impact because in India, in Asia, the concept of where you don't have and it's a very, I'll tell you, it's an observation also of serious consequences to say, well, if you have a complaint about your spouse's adultery, then divorce is the only remedy. That doesn't leave a scope for the legislature to re-amend, because where divorce is the only remedy in the West, you have sharing of property in the area of event of divorce. You have a social security system of the state. Here, with women in gainful employment being very few still, you can actually say your only remedy is a divorce, which means you are effectively driving her to destitution. And therefore, rather than just parrot everything in support of a view which is expressed, I think the section was badly worded. It needed to be struck down. But then the rest of the observations can have many, many social consequences.
Which they've obviously not thought through.
You see, on Sabrimala, the third one which you mentioned, I think this debate has been ongoing. And let me, for the benefit of your audience, explain. The genesis of this whole debate actually is a 1952 judgment of the Bombay High Court. In a speech a few years ago, I had described that as the worst ever judgment in independent India. Though it's a High Court judgment, it actually said that all laws after the Constitution has come into force must be tested on the basis of fundamental rights. But there was a view expressed by two of our most legendary judges, Justice Chagla and Gajendra Gadkar, that personal laws and religious customs and practices need not be tested on that ground. So we have to make up our mind whether that view remains or doesn't remain. I think the right opportunity to overrule that view was the triple talaq case. In the triple talaq case, though the conclusion looked very progressive, but the reasoning was the practice is based on arbitrariness, and so we quash it. They sidestepped the issue of whether personal law and religious practices must also abide by the constitutional guarantees. In fact, one of the judges flagged it and then said, I leave it open for a future case. Even in the Sabrimala, the majority opinion, one of the leading judgments has a chapter on it. Must that be overruled? They gave good reasons why that's no longer a correct view and said, however I don't decide it, I leave it for a future case. Now, if you want to take a progressive step, then Article 14 and 21 will apply against all religions. It can't happen that you select a practice and apply it, because that will have many, many social consequences in a pluralistic society like India. Then if you start stepping into religious practices and customs and say 14 must be tested, into personal laws 14 must be tested, and Article 21, then will it apply to polygamy? Will it apply to oral divorces? Will it apply to other religions where ladies are not allowed to enter religious places? If you have a selective practice and then you use an argument to say, well, we'll decide this issue in some other case every time it arises, then if you are being progressive and bold, then it must be uniformly so. And that doesn't seem to be happening.
But I'm told that on the basis of the Sabrimala judgment, many of these practices in other religions can now be challenged.
If you read the majority opinion, the lead judgment, again says, there's a chapter on this judgment, on these personal laws and religious practices and customs. It discusses it, it gives an argument which is progressive, and then says, however, we leave it for the future generations in an appropriate case to decide. So if you are willing to proclaim, you must be willing to strike. And you must not only be willing to strike at one target, you must be willing to uniformly strike.